In the world of business, success often comes with a price, and for Jake, that price was a hard lesson in humility. What seemed like a victory, $1 million deal, and fame as a tech visionary, was about to unravel in the most unexpected way. Behind every triumph is a story of patience, strategy, and sometimes quiet revenge. This is the tale of how Emily, once overlooked and underestimated, took control of a company that Jake thought he had built from the ground up. Subscribe to the channel to begin today's story with life stories. The deep amber liquid in Jake's glass sloshed dangerously as he gestured, his voice carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never questioned his own success. The dining room, bathed in the warm glow of a chandelier, was filled with the sounds of laughter, the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain, and the subtle murmur of admiration from his family. Tonight was a celebration, and Jake, as always, was the star. The investors couldn't write the check fast enough, he boasted, his designer watch catching the light as he leaned back in his chair. $50 million. Just like that. At the far end of the table, Emily lifted her glass to her lips, taking a slow sip of wine. She didn't speak, but there was something in her expression, an unreadable calm that stood in stark contrast to the excitement around her. Her mother beamed at Jake, the pride in her eyes evident. Her stepfather nodded along, impressed by the young tech mogul he had helped raise. Even Emily's younger sister, Sophie, hung on to Jake's every word, wide-eyed with admiration. Jake turned to Emily then, flashing what he probably thought was a generous smile. And to think, he added, it all started with Emily's little idea. He raised his glass in her direction. Remember that Christmas 2 years ago? That conversation about personalized AI therapy? Who knew it would turn into something this big? Emily set her glass down carefully. It was just a rough concept, she said modestly, her tone light. You're the one who made it real. Jake grinned, lifting his glass higher. Here's to family inspiration. Though maybe next time, try coming up with an idea you can actually execute yourself. There was laughter, though it was tinged with the kind of awkwardness that settled in when someone took a joke a little too far. Emily's mother shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking between them. But Emily simply smiled. It was a practiced smile, smooth and effortless. If Jake only knew what had already taken place. 2 years ago, that Christmas conversation had not been the casual chat he remembered. Emily had spent months developing the AI therapy concept, sketching out detailed business plans, and even building a basic prototype. She had shared it with Jake, looking for genuine feedback, trusting him as family. 3 weeks later, Jake had registered the company himself. Mindwell was born, with Jake Foster as its sole founder and CEO. He had even used the name Emily had suggested. Sophie turned to Emily, her curiosity piqued. Did you really come up with the basic idea? She asked, her voice filled with admiration. Emily nodded, brushing it off. Oh, it was nothing, she said, catching the sharp look Jake sent her way. Just a vague concept. Jake did all the real work. What Jake didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that Emily had never been idle. While Jake had been busy playing the part of a tech visionary, attending conferences and giving interviews, she had worked quietly, methodically. Her background in consulting had given her the right connections. Over the past 2 years, she had built a network of investment firms, each appearing independent but all leading back to her. Every time Mindwell needed funding, one of her shell companies was there, offering attractive terms. Jake, ever confident in his own brilliance, had never questioned why investors were so eager to buy in. He had been too distracted by the attention, too absorbed in his own narrative of success, to notice that with each funding round, his stake in the company shrank while hers grew. A vibration against the table caught Emily's attention. She glanced down at her phone. A message from Mark, her lawyer. Final paperwork filed. You now officially own 75.4% of Mindwell through the holding companies. Congratulations. Emily exhaled slowly, setting her phone down. She excused herself, pushing back her chair with a quiet grace that went unnoticed amidst Jake's ongoing monologue. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The same quiet, unassuming woman Jake had always underestimated stared back at her. Outside, Jake was still talking, his voice filled with triumph. He thought he was celebrating the biggest deal of his life. But in reality, he had just unknowingly sold the majority of his company to her. Emily returned to the dining room, her expression as composed as ever. She slid back into her seat just as Jake launched into another grand explanation of Mindwell's expansion plans. The acquiring company wants to take Mindwell global, he announced, his voice brimming with excitement. They're keeping me on as Chief Innovation Officer with a huge compensation package. It's going to be huge. His stepfather clapped him on the back. That's incredible. Son, I always knew you had it in you. Emily caught Sophie watching her, an odd expression on her younger sister's face. Unlike their mother and stepfather, Sophie had always been more perceptive. Did you work with AI in your consulting job, Emily? She asked innocently, though there was an edge of curiosity that Jake seemed to notice. His smile flickered for the briefest moment. Different kind of AI, he interjected before Emily could answer. Emily's work was much more basic. Emily tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Oh, I'd love to hear more about the technical side of things. Jake, she said smoothly, how did you solve the privacy compliance issues we discussed that Christmas? For the first time that evening, Jake hesitated. The briefest shadow of discomfort crossed his face before he launched into a vague explanation, carefully weaving together just enough jargon to sound impressive. But Emily already knew the truth, because she had developed the very framework he was describing. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from Mark. Acquiring company wants to meet with all major shareholders next week. Time to decide how you want to handle this. Emily looked up from her screen, watching Jake revel in his success. In less than a week, he would learn that his great exit wasn't quite what he thought it was. The company he believed he had sold wasn't really his to sell. More wine, Emily, her mother asked, noticing her distraction. Emily smiled and shook her head. No thanks. I need to drive back to the city tonight. Early meeting tomorrow. Jake smirked. Must be tough still working those long consulting hours. You should have been more entrepreneurial like me, taken some risks. Emily thought about the millions she had spent quietly acquiring control of his company. The intricate legal maneuvering. The patience it had taken to let him believe he was winning. All while she had been playing the long game. We can't all be visionary founders. Jake, she said lightly. Some of us have to do the detail work. Their stepfather raised his glass. To Jake, our family's first millionaire. Everyone clinked glasses. Emily lifted hers, participating in the toast while glancing at her calendar. 6 days. That was when Jake would finally understand what detail work really meant. As dinner wrapped up, Jake pulled Emily aside. His voice had softened, taking on what he likely believed was a generous tone. Listen, Em, he said. I feel bad about how things worked out. How about I throw some consulting work your way once the acquisition is complete? Small token of appreciation for the original idea. Emily studied him for a moment, almost overwhelmed by the urge to tell him everything, to watch his confidence crumble in real time. But she merely smiled. That's very thoughtful, Jake. But let's see how the acquisition plays out first. He clapped her on the shoulder. Already turning away. Your loss. But the offer stands. Family has to look out for each other. Right. Emily's smile didn't waver. Right, she said softly. Family first. The conference room at Mark's law firm was sleek and minimalist. The kind of place designed to make people feel both important and slightly uneasy. Emily sat quietly at the end of the long oak table, her expression composed as always. Across from her, Jake chatted animatedly with the executives from the acquiring company, his confidence unwavering. He barely spared her a glance, likely assuming she was there in some administrative capacity. Emily folded her hands in her lap, watching the scene unfold. Jake, completely unaware of what was coming, carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won. Mark, ever professional, cleared his throat and began distributing folders. Before we proceed with final signatures, he said, we need to review the shareholder structure of Mindwell. Jake barely glanced at his folder as he flipped it open. The moment the numbers registered, he froze. A strange silence filled the room. Emily watched as the color drained from his face, his fingers tightening around the pages as if he could will the words into changing. His throat worked as he tried to speak, but no sound came out at first. This, he finally managed. His voice an odd mix of disbelief and growing panic. This must be a mistake. The numbers are quite accurate, Mark said smoothly. Through various investment vehicles, the majority shareholder of Mindwell is actually Nova Holdings LLC, which owns 75.4% of the company. Jake's eyes darted across the papers, his movements growing increasingly frantic. I've never heard of Nova Holdings, he snapped. Who the hell are they? Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. Nova Holdings is my company. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's head snapped up, his gaze locking onto Emily's with raw confusion and something else, fear. What? He whispered. Emily leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of her words settle. Every funding round, every investment, every major stock purchase over the past 2 years, she said. They all trace back to companies I control. She tilted her head slightly. You never bothered to look too closely at your investors, did you? Jake's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in his life, he looked genuinely lost. But that's impossible, he stammered. You don't have that kind of money. Emily smiled, but there was no warmth in it. My consulting work paid better than you thought, she said. And it's amazing what you can do with good credit and better lawyers when you have a solid business plan. Jake's breathing was uneven now, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the papers. You can't prove I stole your idea. I don't need to, Emily replied simply. She tapped the folder in front of her. The ownership structure is legal and documented. You've been running my company all this time, Jake. You just didn't know it. Jake slumped back in his chair, the weight of realization pressing down on him. Why? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why not just confront me when I started the company? Emily studied him for a long moment before answering. Would you have listened? She asked. Would anyone? She saw the truth flicker across his face. No, he wouldn't have. He had seen an opportunity and taken it, never once considering that she might be capable of doing something about it. That was his mistake. Before he could respond, Mark cleared his throat again. Shall we continue? He asked, his professional tone unchanged. The executives from the acquiring company, who had been briefed on the real ownership structure weeks ago, looked on with mild curiosity. Only Jake had been left in the dark. He swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. Emily didn't take her eyes off him as the meeting continued. Jake had spent years believing he was the master of his own destiny. Now, for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. The weeks that followed were surreal for Jake. The news of Mindwell's acquisition made headlines in the tech world, with his name still appearing in the press releases. He played his part well, smiling for the cameras, giving carefully crafted interviews, but there was a new restraint in his voice. Every statement he made had to be approved by the board, by Emily. The family learned the truth gradually. Sophie figured it out first, piecing together details from press coverage and past conversations. She showed up at Emily's apartment one evening, shaking her head in disbelief. You let him take credit all this time, she said. Why? Emily smiled. handing her a folder with Mindwell's financial reports. Because sometimes, winning isn't about getting credit, she said. It's about having control. Their mother and stepfather took longer to understand. The truth came out over another family dinner. Far quieter than the 1 weeks before. I don't understand, their mother said. Looking between them. Jake exhaled heavily, staring at his plate. I stole her idea, he admitted. I took her work and claimed it as my own. He glanced at Emily. A flicker of something between regret and admiration in his eyes. And she outsmarted me completely. Everything shifted after that. Jake's arrogance faded, replaced by something closer to humility. He had always thought success was about being the loudest voice in the room. Now, he understood the power of quiet, strategic patience. One evening, after a board meeting, he turned to Emily. You could have destroyed me, he said. Why didn't you? She thought for a moment before answering. Because this way, you have to live with knowing exactly who you are, and who I am. It was a lesson that would stay with him forever. Subscribe to the channel for more life stories.